Welcome to Invested in Climate. Protecting the planet and decarbonizing the global economy is the challenge of our time. We all have a role to play, and the opportunity we face is unprecedented. Invested in Climate aims to help people do more to address climate change through their work, investments, lifestyle, and activism. I'm your host, Jason Rissman. I support a growing community of top climate and ESG leaders as the Chief Experience Officer at NationsWell, and I'm an advisor to the climate practice at IDEO. I'm also an investor and startup advisor, and when it comes to climate action, I know I'll be a lifelong learner, always looking to have more impact. If you like what you hear, give us a good rating on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you found us. Sign up for updates and suggest ideas for future episodes at investedinclimate.com. Follow us on social, subscribe, and spread the word. Thanks for joining.
What's really interesting in the market from the climate space is the solutions only continue to get better. Back in the early days, back when I was at Goldman and Cleantech 1.0 in those times, the solutions were generally pretty bad. If you wanted a environmental friendly car, it was just not a fun car to drive. If you wanted plant-based foods, they didn't really taste very good. And just a lot of these solutions were bad. And if you layer in tech evolution that's happened over the last bunch of years, everything's gotten better.
Hi, folks. I'm always excited to talk to climate investors who have been around for a bit. Those that were investing during the Cleantech 1.0 phase, saw the ups and downs, and have stuck through to our current climate tech boom. Some of the challenges that the earlier era of cleantech investing saw, like high capex and long payback periods, are still relevant today, and experienced investors offer nuanced insights to current opportunities and what the future might hold. So I was thrilled to talk to Greg Wasserman. Greg started investing in clean energy almost 20 years ago at Goldman Sachs. I'll let you hear the twists and turns of his background directly from him, but suffice to say he fits the bill of someone that's worn multiple prestigious hats to finance climate solutions. Greg recently closed a new $385 million climate fund at Wellington Management, one of the world's largest independent investment management firms with over $1 trillion of assets under management. We talk about Greg's journey, how climate investing has changed, what he's currently excited about, opportunities for the future, and much more. Lots to learn and think about in this one. Enjoy. Hey, Greg, welcome to Invested in Climate. So glad to have you here today.
Good to see you, Jason. Excited to be here.
Where do I find you today? Where are you calling in from?
I am in lovely New York, New York.
Right. Hopefully no summer heat wave at the moment.
It's definitely hot, but I think we've gotten used to it at this point.
Okay, the new norm.
Apparently, climate change is real.
Apparently. Well, Greg, really thrilled to get to talk to you and hear about your experiences and your insights to climate investing. And before we talk about the work that you're doing with Wellington Management and the recent fund that you closed, let's learn a bit about you, as you really bring a fascinating background, and I'd just love to hear some of the insights that you gathered along the way. I saw that you started your career at Goldman Sachs, focused on alternative energy investing really over 20 years ago. What got you interested in this space long before many others started paying attention to it?
It's been an amazing journey. My time at Goldman Sachs was a foundational part of my career. I started there right out of undergrad and spent the first 8 years of my career there, and really just thrown in the deep end of what you would expect from Goldman Sachs, of long, intense hours and crash course in everything from intense modeling to negotiation and how to interact professionally and how to deal with an investment committee and all those things. The business that I started with was a principal investing business within Goldman that went through some iterations but became what's known as the Special Situations Group. And my first sort of 5 or 6 years, I was focused on specialty finance. So distressed specialty finance assets, we were buying portfolios of credit card receivables or equipment finance and aircraft leases and things like that. And I'd really just gotten bored doing that. There's not a ton of investment thesis. It's all about the model and what kind of price you can pay, and super interesting deals, very profitable deals, but I was just a little bit bored. And we had a team that did structured tax deals, different business unit within the same team. And in 2005, the US government passed the Energy Policy Act of '05, which was where the first major incentives for renewables came out. So it had the first solar investment tax credit, the wind PTC. So my business saw that coming because of our tax expertise more than most, and said, oh, there's probably going to be a bunch of venture capital companies that will benefit from these incentives. Why don't we go invest in them? And some of the senior management knew that I was a little bit bored on the specialty finance side and said, Do you want to go do alternative energy? I had no background in energy or alternative energy, had never really thought much about climate change, to be totally honest, and just thought the technology sounded really interesting. And so I said, okay, I'll go do that. That sounds pretty cool. That was really the start of my journey. And did that for a couple of years at Goldman, which was pretty amazing, especially because it was the very early days of, everyone talks about Cleantech 1.0. This is really the start of it. And so I got very lucky in my timing, just happened to be there for it.
Very cool. So I'm really curious. I mean, that was quite a while ago, and really as the field was nascent, what did your experience at Goldman teach you about the space that's really remained central to your outlook?
Yeah, I think a lot of lessons learned about what we saw in the early Cleantech 1.0 window that worked, and obviously a lot of what didn't work. Back then, everything was all about the technology and all about the cost curves. This is when solar was still a relatively new technology, very expensive, and there were still debates around whether it would be photovoltaics or solar thermal. And if it was solar thermal, is it going to be parabolic trough, or is it power tower, or is it Stirling engines? We saw early phases of new battery technologies. This is when lithium iron phosphate was first coming out with companies like A123. So it was all about just technology, and they were all very expensive back then and needed to get down the cost curve. The game back then was all about cost curves and where you think over the next 3 to 5 plus years, which technology wins that cost curve, and how regulation and the incentives of all the climate packages back then could help down that curve. And I think what was underappreciated back then, obviously, was the capital intensity and reality of getting down those cost curves that led to a lot of the blowups we saw in Cleantech 1.0. And so I think having seen that just really gives a foundation to early clean tech and drives a lot of the investment strategy today.
Greg, from Goldman, you actually took a detour in some respects, and you went to the Clinton Foundation. Tell us about that move and what it taught you.
In some ways, it was a detour. In some ways, it really wasn't. So at Goldman, and this started in sort of late 2007, the firm realized Goldman Sachs probably shouldn't be doing a ton of venture capital investing off the balance sheet. And this was heading into early signs of '08 cracks in the market. I think no one realized how bad it would be. So started saying we really shouldn't be doing venture on the balance sheet. We should focus on infrastructure and tax. I had been asked maybe you should go back to doing the distressed specialty finance investing you were doing, because if there's cracks in the financial markets, it's a massive opportunity. Had really fallen in love with the alternative energy space and really did not want to go back to specialty finance. And one of the junior guys on my team, one of our associates, a guy named Will Deng, who I helped hire and mentor, had left to go to the Clinton Foundation to join their global solar initiative. And it's funny because when he first told me he was going there, I was like, you're going where? A nonprofit? What are you doing there? And he kept telling me how interesting it was. And eventually he said, we have a big team here and we need someone to come run the solar initiative. Can you come speak with the chairman and learn more about what we're doing? So I went there and learned about what they're doing. And it was really fascinating because it was all about using President Clinton's relationships with major governments and heads of state around the world, and how we could use the Clinton Foundation's role as a facilitator to help scale deployment of technology. So we were focused on solar, and it was very much about just solar is really expensive today. How can we drive down the cost in a way that's faster than what the market's currently doing? A lot of what we focused on was scale in a way that you can get there with the government that you can't get there in the private market. It's on its own. So we did a lot of work with, for example, India, and it was all about why is solar so expensive right now? A lot of it was the scale that these projects were being built at, because it's all individual developers finding their own site, building their project, building their transmission, getting their financing, getting their equipment sourcing, and it's all subscale. The pitch was if the government can help facilitate coordinating a lot of that and aggregating that scale, can drive the cost down. And so a lot of our work was running around India, talking to steel companies like, hey, if you built a 50 megawatt project, how much would the steel cost versus if we could get you 3 gigawatts of demand, how much would the steel cost for that? And talking to sources of financing around, if this was the development risk was lower because the government's fronted some of the land, how much would the cost of capital go down? And transmission companies from the state transmission grid operators around, if someone's building a 50 megawatt interconnect versus if you pre-planned a 3 gigawatt solar field that was in the right spot, how much would the cost go down? And it was all about figuring out those ways to use scale to drive down cost in public-private partnerships. And so it was a detour in some way because it was obviously on the nonprofit side, which the Clinton Foundation does, but it was very much all about solar and deploying technology.
Well, it's super interesting to think of your career in some ways as the timeline of following the cost curve of solar and pushing it down along the way. So you then went back into finance and you were a partner at Generation. investment management, a firm founded by Vice President Al Gore. Tell us about that experience.
I did the Clinton Foundation for a couple of years, but at my heart, I'm an investor. I feel like a lot of the work we did at the Clinton Foundation was what an investor would do, but in the end, it wasn't my decision. You were trying to convince the government to do what you thought they should do to spur the market. And so really wanted to go back to the investment side. And I'd known some of the partners at Generation back from my Goldman days and had some chats with them, and I ended up joining there in 2010. My wife and I moved over to London, which is where Generation's based. And I spent 8 years as a partner there. And that was really what I see as the second foundational part of my career. I was there for almost a third of my career. A lot of the deals I did there, I matured as a senior sort of deal lead there and really followed the transition of the space from the Cleantech 1.0 to maybe a bit of evolution towards what the next generation of climate solutions look like. And Generation's a phenomenal firm, great team, great culture, and learned a lot there and did a lot of interesting deals. But I think that probably the most interesting transition there was when I first started there, a lot of what we were doing was still what people would probably still call clean tech. I did a battery chemistry deal, a solid state battery company. We invested in a solar thermal company. We invested in LED technology, a lot of what you think of as core clean tech. And then over time, realized the opportunity around digital. One of my investments at Generation was Nest. I'm a huge fan of what Nest has done. I think it's one of the biggest and best climate solutions we've really seen in the space. And if you look at what they did, founders Tony and Matt, it wasn't really a bunch of deep tech disruptive innovation, which is what most of the climate space was focused on. But they really said, let's reimagine what a thermostat is. And if you look at it, it's really, it's a piece of hardware. We can do digital sensors instead of analog sensors. And so let's put in a screen. Let's put in a digital temperature sensor, a digital motion sensor, near and far field, digital humidity sensors. And then the magic is if you wrap some really smart software and some smart algorithms around it, all of a sudden you can make this thing that used to be disconnected and dumb, you can make it smart and it can start better controlling itself. And that led to a way better user experience. Just people hate their thermostat. All of a sudden you have something you love, you're proud to have it on the wall. It also saves you a ton of money. And it does that by saving electricity because it just more smartly manages your set points. So that for me was really eye-opening around the opportunity that you don't actually need a ton of massive deep tech disruption. But if you move things from analog to digital, put some sensors in there, and then the magic can be the software that you build around it, it really unlocks a lot of opportunity. Over the second half of my Generation time, we started doing more digital deals and even invested in companies like DocuSign, where people don't think of that as a climate solution. But when you think about how much paper and ink and FedExing of signatures around the world, it just saves a massive amount of emissions. A lot of what we do today, which I'm sure we'll get to later, is digital focused. And a lot of that is where that transition came from.
Fantastic. Well, I'm also a huge fan of Nest. I was actually at Google at the time working on the Google Power Meter team,
okay.
which is a home energy monitoring service. And we're all scratching our heads saying like, yeah, if only someone could make people care about thermostats, it would be a way to control the house. And, it came down to it being beautiful, that it's a very cool design and people wanted it.
That point right there has actually been a core part of our investment thesis is it has to be about value proposition to the user first. People, at least at scale, won't buy stuff just because it's green if it means it's a worse experience. Part of what sounds like you and I both love about Nest is it was a better user experience. It also happened to be green, but that's not why most people bought it. That's critical for what we think about today as the good investment opportunities.
Great. Well, thank you for walking us through your background. Super interesting. And it's led you to a really interesting role now. You are the head of private climate investing at Wellington Management. Let's start at the level of just understanding what Wellington is for the listeners that might not know about the firm. Tell us a bit about Wellington and what it's known for.
Sure. Wellington is one of the world's largest independent asset managers. Our history goes back almost 100 years. We have over $1 trillion of AUM that we manage across both public and private markets. The vast majority of the AUM to date is on the public side, public equities, public debt, and most major asset classes. So just very large, very broad asset manager. Everything that we do is active. So we don't do any passive strategies like some of the other large ones do that are just index funds. Everything we do is actively managed, looking for alpha. And I think the firm's really known for very deep research that's shared across the platform, but decentralized decision-making. We don't have a central CIO that says, here's our house view that everyone has to invest in. We have central research And then all the investors can question that research and make their own investment decisions based on that research. There's a culture of research, a culture of collaboration across just a really scaled asset manager. So it's big firm AUM, but it feels quite small. And then I am part of our rapidly growing privates business.
Fantastic. Well, let's hear more about the climate side. You are the head of climate investing, and we should start with the congratulations. You recently raised a sizable climate fund. Tell us about it.
Yeah, I appreciate that. We're really excited to have raised our first fund, which is just under 400 million. I think everyone's aware that it's a really challenging environment for a number of reasons. There's been a bit of a reset in the private markets back following some of the froth that we saw in 2021. So the market's been dealing with that, which has made fundraising just much more challenging. That happened right in the middle of when we were out in the early days speaking to clients. Given that we are a new strategy and a first-time fund, I think that made it longer and more challenging, I think, than we would have liked. But we're really excited that we got the raise done successfully with pretty amazing clients that we're now in the market investing in. So we're really excited about that. And at the highest level, we're focused on climate solutions. Everything we invest in has to either address the underlying cause of climate change, which is carbon emissions. And so anything that helps mitigate carbon is part of the approach. But we also have a practical view that just reality is climate change is already here. If you think about all of the weather events that we see on the TV nonstop and heat, storm, drought, fire, flood, the news just came out Sunday was the hottest day ever recorded in history. So reality is it's here and we have to deal with it. And so anything that helps society adapt and build resilience to the impacts of climate change also fits within our strategy. And we really focus on companies at the early growth stage. We're not an early stage venture team. We're really looking for companies that have tech that's proven, that works, and that is commercially selling in the market kind of past its pilots. So it's really commercially repeatable sales that are scaling from there. We tend to focus on a lot of the areas that you would typically expect to see climate solutions. And so energy transition, food and agriculture, enterprise digitization, industrial optimization, and automation, and transport and mobility. So a lot of those key use cases. But we really focus on, like we talked about a bit before, real value-driven use cases. So not just things that are green, but it has to have a real value proposition for companies and customers first. And a lot of that drives us towards solutions that are a bit more on the digital and more asset-light side than the heavy science, regulatory-driven side.
So congratulations, over $400 million fund, very sizable. But you also mentioned that the firm has over $1 trillion assets under management. So I'm curious about the context of the fund, how it fits within Wellington's larger investing practice. Are you able to leverage research and resources? And are there other ways that Wellington is contributing to climate investing?
Definitely. And our ability to leverage that research and resources and insights is really the key part of why it's exciting to be building this within Wellington. Everything that we do on the private side of our platform is really about leveraging our knowledge from the public side, where we understand the world's largest and best companies, the world's largest markets, and layer in understanding of geopolitics and macroeconomics and all those things you would expect on a large asset manager, and ability to take that and apply that to the private markets and really be smarter investors, both how we are able to access and diligence and invest in deals, but also add value to the companies that we work with over time, just given that unique perspective. Our privates platform really is based on what are the interesting adjacencies to the public markets, because we know we don't want to do everything. So we really look for where we just have unique adjacencies and unique skill sets. And everything about our privates business has been based around that. So the first one is a late stage strategy that focuses on pre-IPO investing, really leveraging Wellington's position as one of the largest IPO investors and most active IPO investors in the world. And so we have unique insights to go pre-IPO. That's been a great success for us. And that was really our first dedicated privates business. We then launched a biomed business because Wellington's one of the largest healthcare investors in the world. And so we have unique perspectives on the biomed space. With climate, we've been investing in climate for a long time on the public side, going back to our first public climate fund was launched in 2007. We have dedicated climate mitigation funds on the public side. We have dedicated climate adaptation funds, interestingly, one of the first standalone adaptation strategies there, public impact funds. And so doing private climate is really an obvious adjacency there to leverage that expertise and also leverage the relationship and market presence that our late stage team has built in the market, because when they invest in the best late stage companies in the world that eventually go on to IPO, that creates great market presence for us and brand recognition that helps our team go source and win some of the best deals. And so it's really about pulling all of that edge and advantage together and applying it to the private climate space.
Greg, you mentioned that you completed the raise in a challenging environment, and climate tech investing has hit a slump in recent years, especially as you've been out in the market raising the fund. Give us your take on the state of play in climate investing. Is investor interest in climate heating up again? How would you describe the market right now?
I think it's a really interesting opportunity in the market right now. If you look at what's happened over the last couple of years, I think that there was a bunch of froth back, and it wasn't just climate. This is, broader tech back in sort of 2020, 2021. You saw these huge raises getting done, both funds raising huge funds and then companies raising huge rounds at really elevated valuations that tracked a lot of what was happening in the broader tech market. A lot of that was riding the tailwinds of the Inflation Reduction Act having recently been passed, and a huge amount of activity, a lot of froth. And as markets tend to do, tech went through a bit of a reset, and that's led to broader venture and growth also going through a bit of a reset where valuations have become a bit more attractive and there's not so much aggressive capital out there in the market. I feel like the opportunity set for an investor is much more interesting now. And what's really interesting in the market from the climate space is the solutions only continue to get better. Back in the early days, back when I was at Goldman and Cleantech 1.0, in those times, the solutions were generally pretty bad. If you wanted a environmental friendly car, it was just not a fun car to drive. If you wanted plant-based foods, they didn't really taste very good. And just a lot of these solutions were bad. And if you layer in tech evolution that's happened over the last bunch of years, everything's gotten better. Tech has got software, connectivity, sensors, the ability to do data analytics, just all of that has gotten better, faster, cheaper. I think we're in this interesting place in the market where the tech just keeps getting better. There's maybe a little bit of pullback from some of the froth that we saw a couple of days ago, and the opportunity set's still there. And then if you layer in the adaptation side, which is the world's just getting hotter and the number of storms and fires that we see on TV just keep going up, I think it just really combines for a pretty interesting market right now.
Fantastic. Well, let's get specific and hear about some of the innovation that you see happening that's most interesting to you and really understand where the fund is focusing.
I think the innovation is really broad. When you think about where climate solutions come from, and if you think about the lens that I mentioned before around anything that addresses the underlying cause of climate change with emissions or anything that affects the impacts of climate change with extreme weather, it's really quite broad and cuts across most of the economy. I always like to say climate is not a sector, it's pieces of pretty much every sector in the market. The opportunity set that we see is really broad. We get really excited about where these climate solutions combine with interesting value proposition to end users. We see a lot of interesting opportunities around software-enabled hardware, where you're adding connectivity and smarts to things, almost what we were talking about before with Nest, and just applying that to a much broader set of use cases. We get really excited by a lot of those opportunities we see. We also get really excited by enablers. If you think about something like renewables, there is a massive amount of capital that's being spent building out energy transition infrastructure. There have been huge funds that have raised in the space, investing in building out renewables, building out batteries, building out storage and other kind of assets. And we look at that and say, we don't invest in infrastructure, we don't invest in assets. And so we don't want to invest in that. But every time someone deploys that capital into those assets, there's all sorts of layers of interesting tech and software that's part of that journey. We look at what's the software, what are the analytics, what are the fintech platforms that is along for that ride. And we try to apply that lens towards a lot of the spaces we look at. And then we also think about business model innovation, where it doesn't necessarily have to be tech, but in the earlier versions of Cleantech, there were the solar financing platforms that popped up around how you can finance solar given the complexity of the tax credits and how you can make that easy for people to deploy solar given the complexity of that. And so that's business model innovation. And we get excited about a lot of things around there as well.
Greg, you mentioned your interest in software, and I know that you also have a background in blockchain. Will blockchain technology make a difference to climate solutions, and where do you see it having the most influence?
I think potentially. I've generally become a bit cautious around where blockchain will be used. I think Blockchain went through a huge hype cycle of it's going to be part of everything and it helps create validity. And I think reality is it's more complex than that. And given the couple of years I spent focused on that space, just take a more cautious approach. We've seen a lot of, for example, companies popping up talking about using blockchain to validate things like carbon credits. The carbon markets generally are not a big focus area of ours because it's too regulatory for our investment approach, too regulatory driven. But a lot of companies pop up and, blockchain will help validate and make sure these are real credits and that they're valid and they're not duplicated. And blockchain is kind of the solution for that. And I think reality is just a little bit more complex than that because, yes, once a credit's tracked on blockchain, you can make sure it's not duplicated. But there's a lot of complexity that goes into getting it onto blockchain in the first place and taking something that's analog and first making it digital on chain. That step right there is where you run into just all the complexities you have with the normal carbon credit market of how you make sure this is a real credit and that it's actually reducing things. And blockchain doesn't really solve that onboarding piece. So just because of that, take a more cautious approach. I do think that there are some really interesting use cases around blockchain and distributed ledger around data sharing and smarter controlled data exchange that can maybe open up some opportunities around supply chain visibility and things like that. But it's early. And so we just take a more cautious approach.
Greg, clearly you're focused on delivering ROI to your investors, but given the climate focus, I'm sure you're thinking about impact as well. I'd love to understand how you're thinking about it and also how are you measuring impact for a fund like this?
It's obviously a very critical thing because we're focused on both delivering returns, but impact alongside it. At Wellington, we have a dedicated impact management and measurement team that works across all of our funds that have ties to impact on the public and private side. And we've really worked with them to develop our own framework. We call it our climate materiality framework. It's based on some of the existing standards that are out there, things like Impact Management Project and some others, but it's our own kind of implementation of it. And we really focus on what is the specific climate impact that this company's solution is delivering. How do you measure that? How big do we think that is in the market? We really try to think about the addressable market over time, not necessarily what this company will do over the next couple of years. I think about something like Tesla from the really early days. I looked at Tesla when I was at Goldman back in 2007. Miss, we didn't invest, but if we looked at Tesla and said, what do we think Tesla will do over our 5-year hold period? The impact would be pretty minimal. But if you think about what impact Tesla's had on the entire market for transport and how big that is, that's really the goal that you're going for. And so we try to think through that lens of how big could this be over time, not necessarily just over the short term. And do we think that impact is material enough? There's tons of things out there that could have a little bit of impact, could have some benefit, but we're really looking for things that are material. There's obviously a lot of judgment that goes into what material is, but that's a key part of our framework. And then we also think about what is the risk to that impact going away. We don't really put a strong requirement around what everyone calls intentionality. It doesn't have to be that the company is doing this to generate climate impact. If it's just an effect of what they do, that's okay. But we really have to make sure that there's no risk of it going away. And so that usually means that the impact has to be tied to the core of what the company does. It's not just a little tangential thing that maybe a feature they could turn off and then all of a sudden the climate impact goes away. It has to be really core to what the ultimate solution is. I think the fact that we work with our impact team is a really important part of how we ensure credibility to the process. Deal people just doing deals and them doing some quick climate math to convince themselves that it's a material solution is one way to do it. But there's a lot more rigor when you have an independent team that's questioning the assumptions and adding a sort of independent layer to the analysis. And so that works really well for us. And we're excited about the process that we've built.
Greg, thank you for that. We've been talking at a pretty high level, and I'd love to zoom in a bit and get more tangible and talk about some of your investments. You recently led a Series B investment in a company called Orennia. Tell us about that company and why you invested.
Yeah, Orennia fits very much into the theme I was talking before about enablers. They are a software company that focuses on data and analytics for energy transition infrastructure. Their focus areas are anybody that is building or investing in utility scale solar or wind or battery storage or hydrogen or carbon capture or, more recently, data centers. And it's really about the data that you need to invest in those areas or develop those areas for project developers. And so their customers are project developers, major utilities, major infrastructure funds, major financiers of projects. And it's really about just better access to the data that you need as part of that decision making. So if you think about somebody that is developing and building a utility scale solar project, they have to figure out, where can I put this project? What sites are available? How much does that land cost me? What is the solar resource at those different sites? How close are those sites to transmission? How much will it cost me to build transmission to the nearest connective node where I can get my interconnect? If I connect to that point in the grid, what are the forward price curves that I think I could get for this project at that specific point? And there's just a ton of information that goes into modeling and building and developing those projects. And just historically, a lot of that was very, very fragmented. There were some data sources, you could find bits and pieces of it. Some you had to hire consultants to go find some of that for you. And the founders of Orennia came out of the consulting side. They used to do this for energy customers that wanted that data, and they would be the consultants you would pay to go find it. And they decided to launch a data platform to do that. It's really exciting because it's now a one-stop platform where you can just get this data online immediately without having to go dig across a lot of different places for it. And it really lets all of these participants in building and financing energy infrastructure just make better, smarter, faster decisions. It's very much an enabler. It's enabling a huge amount of energy transition across all those broad areas I mentioned. We really like stuff like that because it's just this software layer within this massive industry that really gets to ride the amount of capital that's getting deployed there. Yeah, my colleague Mike DeLucia leads our energy transition and smart building sector, led their Series B back in 2023. We're really excited about how they're doing.
Greg, who else? I'm sure there's other companies you'd like to give a shout out to and probably who help reflect the investment thesis behind your fund.
Sure. We love all of our children the same, but one that I'm personally very closely involved in and on the board of is a company called Span. Span's based in San Francisco, and they sell a software-enabled circuit breaker panel. So I think there's a lot of parallels to what we were discussing before with Nest around the ability to take a piece of hardware and add some smarts to it and let it do some interesting things. Span was founded by a pretty phenomenal entrepreneur named Art Rao, who used to be at Tesla and helped invent the Tesla Powerwall. He realized one of the major pain points with electrification, which is a big theme in climate change, residential electrification in particular, where consumers are taking parts of their life and parts of their house that used to be powered by fossil fuels, and they're now electrifying it. And so people are getting electric vehicles, they're getting heat pumps, they're getting induction stoves, they're adding solar, they're adding batteries, and really electrifying everything and moving away from fossil fuels, which is great. One of the major underappreciated pain points that's come up as part of that is your house now uses way more electricity than it did before. Depending on the specifics of your power supply and what you had and what you've added, it could be 2 to 3x the amount of power that you're using previously. And all of a sudden, the circuit breaker panel that was 100 years old and it hasn't changed in that time, but everybody has one somewhere in their basement or on a wall somewhere, and nobody thinks about it, all of a sudden the circuit breaker panel becomes a choke point because the amount of power that's coming into the panel from the utility is not enough to meet all the power demands from everything that's connected to the panel. So the way that pain point has manifested itself to date is you add an EV charger and an induction stove and you trip the amount of power that you're coming into your house, you now have to double the capacity you have from your utility. And so if you upgrade from 200 amps to 400 amp supply, that's incredibly expensive. You have to go dig up your yard and rip up walls and add a second panel. And it's really disruptive. And Arch and the team at Span realized that if you can actually monitor everything that's happening across each individual circuit, and so their circuit breaker puts sensors in every circuit with some software wrapped around it, you can actually intelligently manage the load and throttle certain things up or down, like an EV charger, just for the few minutes that you would have tripped the total supply coming into the house. And you could throttle something down to make sure that you don't trip that. So it's really just taking something that was dumb and making it smart and dynamic and can save a really expensive and very disruptive upgrade into the house. And it's really tied to the deployment and adoption of batteries and solar and electric vehicles that we're really excited about. And there's also some just really interesting benefits around adoption of backup power and storage that just make it a great user experience.
Greg, you've been in the space for a long time and you've seen ups and downs. So I'm curious, what do you see coming next? What do you see for the next, say, 5 to 10 years for climate investing?
I think there's always going to be up and downs, but I think that we just see continued deployment of these technologies, continued scale, continued declines down the cost curve, and just continued adoption. And if you look at even just the basics, right? We don't need a whole bunch of new disruption, but if you look at solar and renewables, if you look at batteries for storage, if you look at electric vehicles, the adoption curves on those just keep going up and to the right as the cost of those keep coming down. It's never always up and to the right. There's always little ups and downs in there, but the trends feel pretty clear. And so I think it's just all about more and more adoption. Going a little bit back to our sort of software and enabler discussion, just more and more layers of how you ease all of that adoption and just make it better, faster, cheaper, easier for people to do that, and better user experiences along the way that lead to all of that. We think that's what keeps happening. I do think you'll start seeing more and more adoption of climate risk analytics. We've seen a number of companies pop up that help enterprises, banks, insurance companies, airlines think through climate risk of their assets and their operations. And you're just in the early days of seeing adoption there. And so I think we'll start seeing more and more smart adoption of climate risk and how that can impact how you're deploying assets and how you manage your operations, and smarter supply chain visibility and technology to make everything more resilient to climate shocks, but that also can be more resilient to more general geopolitical shocks. And really just think you'll see that. Definitely expect noise along the way around wars popping up in Ukraine, and you can never predict what happens geopolitically. So it's never a smooth journey, but I do think you will just see a continued evolution and deployment of all the technologies we've been seeing.
Greg, thank you so much for your time today. It's so great to learn from you and hear more about what you're doing.
Awesome. Really appreciate it. We've had some great guests and I'm honored to be included among them, and I look forward to hearing it.
All the best. Thanks for joining us for this episode of Invested in Climate. Please remember to rate us on Apple, Spotify, or Google. Find show notes, sign up for updates, get in touch, and visualize your climate action at investedinclimate.com. This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and does not constitute financial, accounting, or legal advice. Thanks again.